Right, my first memory of seeing Split Enz and meeting them was in 1975, when we had decided as Roxy that it was time to go to Australia and New Zealand and do a bit of touring. So we got on a plane at Heathrow, and it was a very long journey. I mean, it's a long journey now, but it was even longer then. It was probably something, it took us about 27 hours or something to get via the Middle East, via India, you name it. We arrive in Sydney, absolutely shattered. I go to my hotel room, literally I have a visual on this, falling backwards on the bed, collapsing on the bed, turning the telly on, and there were Split Enz. I mean, talk about fate when I think about it. It's incredible. They had come over from New Zealand and they were on a show called GTK, and they were playing Stranger Than Fiction linked to Time for a Change. And I, in very sort of biased thinking, thought process, thought in Australia, what kind of music? It's going to be very backward, terrible, really. And I saw this stuff, and I thought, what the dickens is this? This mad music, and they're all dressed up and sort of strange people. So I thought that completely sort of blew my mind. And then turn up at the sound check at the Hobart Pavilion the next day for the first Roxy gig. They're the support band. So that's another incredible coincidence. Well, I had no idea who the support band was going to be. As it turns out, Island Records had to do with Michael Gudinski, and he was their manager, and so he would get them on with a whole bunch of people who would come out from the UK and play, and they just arrived. They hadn't recorded their first album, but I watched them from the side of the stage, thought they were incredible, and then walked past their dressing room, stuck my head in and said, wow, you guys, that's fantastic. Anything I can do to help? And I carried on walking. And this is my story, side of the story. A little head popped out and said, will you produce our album? And I thought, yeah, dream on, you're here. It took me 27 hours to get, and there's no way I'm coming back. Anyway, it transpired that they went and recorded Mental Notes in Sydney. And then, strangely enough, I got this call, or in those days, probably a telex, to the management company, my management company, saying, would you produce the album? They're coming over. And I'm not sure whether they actually had the deal with Chrysalis then, but something happened, they got the deal. And they came over, and, that was in 1976, the next year. And so 50 years later, we've been through lots of experiences together over the years, watching their development, watching it turn into Crowded House, Tim's solo albums, him playing on my solo albums. And then, quite frankly, I thought that they were totally broke before they went back to Australia the first time. And I'm sure I did pay them session fees to sing on both Tim, Neil and Eddie on K-Scope, and that probably helped pay for their tickets to go back home. From whence they rose like the ashes, as always. The music has to do it for you. And they wrote some great, more straightforward songs in some ways, with catchy choruses, and they became big and fantastic. And so it was a wonderful story. But that particular time when they were in London, they thought that it was just because it was their association with someone from Roxy and all that, we were huge, that would guarantee them instant success. Unfortunately, everybody was in fear of being cancelled by the punk scene. And we thought, well, we're bound to be for the chop. As it happened, Sex Pistols used our producer and our friend Chris Bedding to do their demos. So it seemed that we were somehow safe to a certain extent. But unfortunately, when Tim and the lads arrived, the timing wasn't right for them. Well, that's an interesting question because I never listened to it. I just, got on with the job in front of me. We went to the rehearsal room, I heard the songs, and I dealt with what I had. So I didn't listen. You see, you've got to remember there was no internet, there was no, I mean, no one gave me a copy, and no one said, have a listen to this and then decide whether you want to do it or anything. I knew I wanted to do it. I knew I had the sort of ability through having learned how to produce from Chris Thomas and all the albums I'd done and all Eno and all these kind of things. And I thought, right, here's my victims. I'm going to apply everything I've learnt to these guys who have got great tunes, and we're going to record it in the British George Martin school of recording type of production, where I don't touch the desk or touch EQs, the engineer does it. I think conceptually, I think what's the song, when I say what's the song about, there wasn't sort of time to ask what it was about, but they had it all down anyway. And production is easy if you've got very talented people, because you don't have to come up with the ideas, they do it for you. And it's, to be fair, it's their album, and that is the George Martin's sort of approach. You're not an engineer trying to be a producer, you're just trying to think conceptually. I could see, the vibe of the whole thing. And it's only just recently that I've realised that Robert Gillies was such an important part of making it different, having the trumpet and the saxes, to the first album. And it added that extra dimension of colours on the colour palette that one could use. And so it was good teamwork, if you like. And, they delivered. That's the thing. If I said, I applied the sort of techniques I used that came from the Beatles, of doubling things up, and the guitars and the acoustic guitars, and having them not intentionally slightly out of tune, but when they were, it created a nice sort of 12-string sound. And I can hear in some of the guitar things that they'd used my pedal board, which I've got here, which was a Pete Cornish pedal board that Fripp had and Genesis had, and I had with a special fuzz box and a special thing. So we did what was possible. And of course, Rhett Davis had worked with me and Eno on Eno's albums. So we were used to experimenting and just putting little touches of sound innovations in there, which I'd have to go in minute detail to give you examples. But yeah, when you're playing like in the traditional way, where a band write a song, they rehearse it, they learn it, they come into the studio, and what you're after is to capture a good vibe, a take. So maybe there was 2 or 3 takes. You're looking at if people slowing down or speeding up at different times from other people. It doesn't matter if they all speed up or all slow down at the same time. And they're all in the same room doing the backing track. And getting a good take was the way you used to do that. And there was no cutting between take 1 of that track and take 5 of that track or anything like that, which was what used to happen at Abbey Road and all sorts of people. We did with Roxy, stuff like that. It was very much, let's try and get a whole take of something with an overall feel, and then proceed to the next stage. And that's why when I looked at my notebook recently, I had it all mapped out, and the ticking boxes of what needed to be done and who was going to play what, where, and just being organised and helping them achieve, a good album. I felt that they knew what they were doing. I'm a similar age to Tim. For some reason, I thought he was a lot younger than me. But, I just had more time in a studio to feel comfortable. I don't think they felt uncomfortable, but there is always a time, especially in those days when you're in a studio, where you've got to deliver. You know, there is the jeopardy thing. You've got to deliver all together. And when you're doing these takes, you don't want to mess up, you know. So there is that, you're on edge to a certain extent, and you have to remind people to listen to each other and make sure the sound in the headphones, they can hear each other, and you're all in the same room playing together. Having said that, you know, the vocals weren't live. Everything, you know, as much as possible was overdubbed afterwards. But, you know, the basic tracks, once secured those, then those people can go and like relax and play soccer, football on the table or whatever with the Wailers. Yes, quite frankly, listening back to it now, there wasn't a weak link. You know, to a certain extent, the only person I had a little bit of trouble with was Phil Judd, because his voice was quite different to Tim's and quite bleaty at stages, you know. I saw that in a funny way, in a simplistic way of saying, oh, he's the sort of early Peter Gabriel type of bleating type sound, and Tim is like the Elton John who sings absolutely brilliantly and perfectly. And so the tuning on Phil Judd, we didn't have auto-tune or anything like that then, so you had to try and do a few takes and then chop together maybe. So you couldn't really fix stuff like you can now. So you had to work with the limitations that you had. But the other thing is, when you say 24-track recording, you couldn't really use track 1 or track 24 for certain things because it was very near the edge of the tape. So there's the different constraints of analog recording. So you basically had 22 tracks. And so I noticed that on the guitar track, there's about 5 different kinds of guitars. And when you mixed, it was all hands on deck. You had to sort of say, right, at this point, you move the fader there. And I was used to doing that. So it was all very analog, and it wasn't like computerized or computer. So it was very much alive. There was jeopardy in mixing, and there was jeopardy in recording and in the performance. So you had to have a safe pair of hands or not to be fazed by that. And also there's the sort of chutzpah of being young, and you just go from A to B and you assume that these people can play. Well, I now, listening to it, I'm just amazed how good they were. And I think Eddie and Tim really, when they listen to this album, they realize, they remember how good they were as musicians. Like whether it's the drums, the bass, the saxophones, you know, Eddie, obviously. I mean, it's a real good band, that, which for one reason or another started disintegrating. I remember inviting Eno to pop in. And I think Tim remembers something that he said, which was the spark for actually doing the forensics albums, because he liked a particular section of something, a particular section of something else. But it probably was a bit too varied for Eno at the time. But there were bits that he really liked. I think that was great fun. But one of the great fun bits was outside the control room in the so-called play area, which was absolutely tiny. They had a football table. And of course, Bob Marley and the Wailers were recording Exodus. So there was just Split Enz and Bob Marley and the Wailers in the other studio playing sort of football in the football table football area. So you couldn't get a stranger collection of people in one. I mean, that is such a great visual memory. Well, also us looking through the porthole into the studio where they were and just seeing a mass of smoke, basically ganja, it was like, there seems to be a cloud in there, like. The one thing that people tend to home in on straight away is the voice. Tim's voice and Phil's voice is together at times created something that's quite unique and different. And then you get the musicality of the whole thing, which, as it turns out, is quite rare because it's not conventional prog rock, and it's not you can't put it in a bag and describe exactly what it is. It's a mixture of a whole bunch of things, and it really depends. If you're listening to maybe Split Enz on a Spotify list or something like that, you're probably going to be drawn in initially by the singles that came later. But then if you wanted to explore a few tracks, you'd go listen to Time for a Change or something and find not a conventional song, but a pretty easy song to get into that's just piano and voice and then a wonderful instrumental ending. So it's sort of easy to get into that. It really depends. It's difficult to say this day and age. There's so many bands and things to delve into. It's just, I guess, if something you take a fancy to and come into it from a different, maybe you liked Crowded House or something, and then you decided to go backwards and follow Neil's career, and then you end up at this album where it sort of all started, really. Well, I loved punk because the ethos of punk was the same as the ethos of Roxy. You didn't have to go to music college to learn how to play. If you knew 3 chords and you had an attitude and you had a look and you had something that had some resonance, you could be successful. So you could be successful and you didn't have to go to a major. It was all about energy and image and music. And it's always been about image and music. It doesn't have to be the most complicated music. So we felt, a lot of us, me, and that they, had been influenced to a certain respect with that ethos. Obviously, when I knew that Chris Spedding was helping them and that Chris Thomas was producing the Sex Pistols, I thought, well, wow. And that the same engineers that we'd used were doing the thing. And, early Roxy, 3 chords, remake, remodel and stuff like that, that could have been a punk song. But obviously there was, I think Andy bumped into Sid Vicious one day in Soho and he said, oh yeah, I really like the band, but actually I can't say on camera what he said about the singer. But we knew we were sort of safe. Susie and the Banshees recorded their first single at my studio. Obviously later, Duran Duran did the first #1 single at my studio and stuff like that. So always, excited by new stuff and the energy. They were totally aware, because Tim tells a story, and he's probably told it to you before, about playing at St. Martin's art school, and they came out afterwards and there were people arguing, punks arguing and saying this should be sort of cancelled in today's language, and the others saying, yeah, but we like it, but so they was like confused. They liked it, but they sort of didn't dare. That was the sort of negative side of sort of Stalinist thing of like, you're either for us or against us type attitude. And anything that smacked of prog rock, that was out the window, They didn't really understand what the hell was going on because of the look was just so different. And it was, people used to say when Roxy first appeared, it was something from another planet. But Split Enz were just from completely other planet. Oh, they love Bowie. But, I wasn't, I can hear tiny bits there, but it changes so quickly that you can't sort of pin down a whole song and say, that sounds like so-and-so, or that sounds, which was great, really, for them, because it you know, everybody creates music that is a combination of stuff that's influenced them. And then the different people in a band have certain things in common, but things they don't have in common. And when they all get together as a band, these influences come out and hopefully create something unique. And I think this particular version of Split Enz was quite unique and different. Now, whether it wasn't a sort of cynical attempt to be commercial, or it was them expressing their likes and their dislikes and putting it all together and really presenting it in what they thought was a visually attractive fashion, which is exactly what Roxy was about, doing interesting music and presenting it in a visually attractive way. Well, obviously in the studio, they weren't dressed like that at all. They were just in their civvies. I mean, just as Roxy weren't dressed the way on stage in the studio. It was like theatre. You put on stage clothes when you went on, and you put on makeup because you're under theatrical lighting and stuff like that. So no, being in the studio was about music. It was about tempos. It was about everything, tuning. It was about playing the right parts. It was a more technical side of doing stuff. But yeah, you know, when you're producing, say, right, let's give it some welly on this take. That was a bit sort of mamby-pamby or something. Come on, let's really make it this energetic or something. And you know, as a producer, you're trying to capture that moment or making it special for the vocalist and making sure that the sound in his headphones are just beautiful, and so he can just inhabit the musical world. And really the same for all the other people doing overdubs, you know, that it's... So there is a technical craftsmanship aspect to producing, as well as the sort of psychological aspect of it. Keeping the happy, keeping everybody, keeping the pace of the whole session going. For a start, my general thought on this album reminds me of when I went to listen to it in Dolby Atmos. And I hadn't listened to it for 50 years, quite frankly, in detail. Maybe I'd heard one track, a little bit of one track, or seen something on YouTube. And I was absolutely gobsmacked at how good it was and how good they were. And it was a complete revelation. And I could hardly believe that I was involved with it, quite frankly. I thought, did I do anything on this? That sounds so bloody good. Really, they must have been so good. They just did it for themselves. And I managed to capture it, which is exactly what I would have wanted to do. And I've done with all the productions that I've worked on, whether it's Gilmore or Split Enz, you know, you just want them to achieve something that's good. And they did. Well, the fact that they're doing some live shows is absolutely brilliant. I can't wait to see it, because now they have a huge catalogue that includes hits. And so it's going to be a fantastic show. I'm really looking forward to seeing the two brothers singing together again. You know, I haven't seen them singing together since they did the Finn Brothers shows here in London. And obviously I've worked with Tim on 2 albums, and I've seen Neil play with Fleetwood Mac and with Crowded House, which is totally brilliant. But to see them all with Eddie and with Noel, it's going to be a real treat. I think it's going to be a fantastic show. So very exciting, looking forward to it.